Hello, everyone. Hopefully you can all hear me. Everyone is on mute automatically. Thank you very much for joining us. I've still got a few more people joining, which is very exciting. Just to quickly introduce myself before I get going. So my name is Ben Hart. I'm a coordinator at Extinction Rebellion Southwark, and we're very lucky to be joined here today by Paul Jepson, or Dr. Paul Jepson, sorry, and Cain Blythe, who are going to be talking through their new book, Rewilding, the Radical New Science of Ecological Recovery. So if you bear with me, I'm still admitting people into the room here. But so as a quick agenda point, we've got about five minutes or so of just quick introduction to Extinction Rebellion. We'll be doing an Extinction Rebellion style breakout and check-in just for 5 minutes. We'll put you into breakout rooms. And then we will be going across to Cain and Paul for the talk. We will look at doing a break as and when it is appropriate. And then there's some time at the end for questions. We'll get everyone to break into rooms again and have a quick chat. And then we'll be looking at questions. We'll open up the chat box and unmute people so that you can actually ask questions as well. So just to get going, if you bear with me. So, Extinction Rebellion, who are we? So we are the Southwark group of Extinction Rebellion. Extinction Rebellion is a non-violent, direct action civil protest organisation, and we aim to elicit government action on the climate and ecological crisis. I'm sure many of you will be aware of who we are. A lot of the promotion has been done via our social network and our newsletter, so that should hopefully have a lot of XR rebels in the room. If you don't, you might have heard of the greatest hits. So the April Rebellion had about 1,330 arrests, and then last year there was an October Rebellion as well with about 1,700 arrests. Our three demands are, tell the truth about the ecological crisis and declare a climate emergency. And it was great to see that actually after the rebellion in April, that happened very quickly. That was one of the lasting legacies of Theresa May, was actually declaring the climate emergency and committing to net zero by 2050, which, as most scientists and anyone who actually pays attention to this is telling you, it's far too late, but at least it's a start. The second demand is greenhouse gas net zero and halting of biodiversity loss by 2025. And that is a much more ambitious target that we will continue to push for until we hit 2025. And I'm sure we'll still be pushing for it then. And the third one is to convene a citizens' assembly on climate and ecological justice. And that's really important. Extinction Rebellion don't have all of the answers. There are lots and lots of people out there who do. But we feel that a citizen assembly is a fair and just way of organising that. And actually, since this demand, all three of these demands were quite ambitious at the time that Extinction Rebellion kind of launched onto the scene. And actually, citizens assembly has been undertaken by the government recently. It's not got any teeth, which is a shame, but it certainly has been a model that has been used both in national government, but also on a local level. And lots of local authorities are creating citizens assemblies, which is really great to see. The big news is that over the last week or so, there's been a launch of the next rebellion. So obviously, COVID has caused a lot of changes in all of our lives, and we're still sort of catching up and working out what that looks and how things are going to change going forward. It is a prime opportunity to reset our economy, and there's a lot of voices out there calling for ambitious green recoveries. And the 1st of September, the phrase is, we want to live. Extinction Rebellion will be going to Parliament, will be protesting outside Parliament, and making sure that when the MPs rejoin Parliament, they are aware of where we feel the important focus should be. More info when we have that. So I'm just going to hand over to Ben, another Ben Andrews, who is the coordinator for the Southwark XR Rebel Gardeners, and he's just going to go through a couple of the slides and explain what it is that the Rebel Gardening Group do within Southwark.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Ben. Yeah, I thought it was a prime opportunity for a bit of a plug for the Southwark Rebel Gardeners Working Group. So yeah, if we get into the slide, Ben, that'd be lovely. Brilliant. Yeah, so there's probably about 30 to 40 active members, some very heavily involved, some on the kind of periphery a bit, but already eager to kind of get involved with gardening in Southwark. I mean, we range from expert gardeners to kind of plant and hope gardeners. I'm definitely on the latter end of that scale. And I've put down some points about what our purpose is, to show like we've got some kind of structure, which we kind of do, but essentially it says here, plant seeds of change within the communities. We basically look to see what the need is locally, whether that be helping with a local community garden, or it might be to plant some trees somewhere. We want to kind of use the weight of kind of XR Southwark to kind of advocate for the kind of tackling the ecological and climate crisis, which we're all here to do, really. So yeah, that's a bit of a very much overview, and on the next slide I'll give some more kind of tangible examples of exactly kind of what we do, which might be a bit useful. So we do a lot of community outreach, and that involves kind of working with different estates in Southwark. So we've got a plot of land which we're working with the Draper estate. We're looking at kind of, getting stuck in, applying for grants, getting some kind of re-landscaping some sites which are just kind of peripheral land at the moment and aren't being used, and kind of working with the community members to get them all involved in gardening. And it's great to meet new people, to meet people in Southwark, and to kind of speak to them about the crisis whilst doing some gardening. So that's been great, and we've got another project in East Dulwich Estate as well. We also try and do some lobbying. Lots of people came to us and said, look, we're really upset about the historic tree loss in Southwark, and there's been about a net loss of 2,000 trees over the last 5 years, and that's just because the austerity kind of policies has meant that, all the trees that have died haven't been replaced because there's been a lack of budget. And we're working with the council who've got a grant to plant some more, and we're going to try and support them with that. So we're not just kind of XR blocking roads, we try and engage the systems as well. And yeah, we do some ad hoc kind of projects, such as there's a community centre and a sheltered housing down in Bermondsey, and we kind of go there and provide some gardening supports, like communal gardens, which is great. And yeah, not to mention, we do kind of get involved in direct action where we can. So, you would have seen us in Trafalgar Square, kind of blocking some of the roads with planters and using kind of more symbolic greenery to assist in some of those big direct actions. But yeah, if there's a need, we'll try and answer it. And yeah, so that's kind of what we do. We do a little bit of outreach to see what that need is. Perfect, thanks, Ben. If you've got the next slide. Yeah, this is Occupy, not Oak Uppy, which I was trying not to say all the time, but yeah, so that's good. Basically, this is just a project that we want to plug here as well. We're working with Lambeth XR, a member of which has been speaking to nurseries, and there's about 750,000 oak saplings which are going to be mulched because there was a demand from the government which hasn't been kind of fulfilled. So we're looking at basically saying, what can we do with these saplings? And we're going to try and order them, use our networks, identify spaces in Southwark, but of course all around the country. So if anyone's listening that kind of thinks, oh, I've got a plot of land, that could kind of, we could plant some oak trees, and we'll help facilitate that. This will be free, but of course donations gladly accepted. It's all voluntary after all. But yeah, unless, Ben, you've got anything more to add on that, it's basically just a bit of a, if you're interested, send us an email, or we'll send you an email after this to get some interest in it.
Yeah, thank you, Ben. So what we'll do is we'll actually follow up after this. We are recording this talk, so that will go up on our YouTube channel, and we'll follow up with the link to that talk and further details about this. This is all of this is just an initial kind of thinking and planning stage. So we're open to feedback. If people are interested in this idea, we'd like to hear about it. And if you like the name, we'd also like to hear about that as well. So thank you very much, Ben. Cool. So just to carry on. If you're interested in more, if you're not part of Extinction Rebellion, there's various different ways to join in. It's not all about the protesting. I think that's really important that sort of Ben kind of how Ben has described it there. We do a lot of great work, and there's lots of different groups doing lots of things. Yes, we do the lobbying and the advocacy with the council. We like to think ourselves as a critical friend. We want to be there, we want to support, and we also want to make sure that people are focusing on where we feel are the right areas. And the climate emergency it's the big emergency that's coming after the one we're currently living through now. So if you go to rebellion.earth, you can fill in a form that will then give you details to find the local group. You can also go straight through to our own XR Southwark website, which is xrsouthwark.earth. And there is opportunity to donate. Obviously, this talk is free, but we're also, we're a community group and we survive on the generosity of others. So if you do feel like donating anything, there's a link there. So I am now going to, bear with me, I'm going to try and get everyone into breakout rooms. So just 5 minutes, if you bear with me, options. Right, I'm going to be creating a number of breakout rooms. There's going to be 4 to 5 people in each room. And just literally 5 minutes, sort of quick introduction, introduce yourself, who are you, and really how's your day going, and what brought you to this talk. That'd be very interesting. So hopefully you'll get an invite now if I press the button.
Screen. So yeah, we're delighted. Paul and I are very delighted to be able to give this talk. First one we've done since we started promoting the book. So please bear with us. And we're both extremely passionate about rewilding, and we're both sort of scientifically educated, I suppose, and trained, but we're also practitioners, and we're very keen on kind of grounding rewilding and understanding how that works. And I don't know if it's been the same for you, but both Paul and I have really felt that during lockdown, there's been, a lot of talk of the comeback of wildlife, and we've been seeing emergence of wildlife even in the streets. I mean, even just the other day I was reading about otters in the high street of Devizes in Wiltshire, and we've heard a resurfacing of birdsong, and this is just over a short period of time. Another thing we've kind of observed is the kind of collective enjoyment of open spaces that communities have been embracing, and we found that this is really quite inspiring. There is definitely some momentum, and this is kind of emerging with the sort of unfolding of spring. And I think it's making us all rethink, the value of nature in our lives. We've missed it, and it's important to us. And I think this new appreciation comes at a time which you'll all be very familiar with. It follows a year where citizens have taken to the streets. And they want their voices heard, and this is a response of the urgent and meaningful kind of response to climate change. At the same time, over the last kind of period, we've been seeing the emergence of new bills, new documents. There's the Environment Bill, and you might not know, but within it there are actually strong guiding principles relating to nature recovery. At the same time, we've seen excellent books such as Rewilding, written by Isabella Tree, who's with Charlie Burrell, they run the Knepp Estate over in Suffolk. It's a very inspiring book about nature and how it can rebound. And Paul and I, like many conservationists, we've been trying quite hard to find ways to encourage nature to come back. We've been conservationists. We've got over 30 years experience of managing land, advising governments on conservation policy, how to practice nationally and internationally to improve those sorts of areas that support nature. We've been involved as well in helping to protect certain areas, planting thousands of trees, hundreds of thousands of trees, restoring lakes, helping species recover. But despite our efforts and the efforts of many conservationists like us, we feel like it's now a time to pivot from a protectionist perspective to one of recovery. Many generations have tried very hard to make this work, but unfortunately we're not yet winning the battle. So now is a time when society could really start to move from a degrading nature to one of a nature that's being restored. And we think that this can act as a force to shape a better future for all life. And this is a really fundamental point. This is something that's uniting when it comes to the idea around rewilding. So, this image we've presented to you here is just a a vision for a healthy ecosystem in the UK. It's where people and wildlife can interact. And you know, people are fundamentally important when it comes to rewilding. But how can we get there? One of the issues we have is that the traditional focus in the 20th century has been on one of protecting and managing habitats and species. You know, we're familiar with rare heathlands, marginal habitats such as heathlands, and small populations of bittern and highly protected great crested newts. But this, unfortunately, has not yet been able to halt the declines. I'm sure you've seen many graphs like this, and they're not good reading. And this is not what rewilding is about, but it's important as a backdrop to understand that so far we've not been able to halt the declines. We've you know, conservation efforts have had some great successes in terms of retaining and protecting some cherished Victorian natures, let's say, nature at a time where you know, the plundering of nature by the rich and entitled kind of started. But this decline is now resulting in the nature emergency that we now face. And Britain, sadly, is one of the most nature depleted countries in the world. And this is a terrifying figure. So, and similarly, conservation programs have seemingly lost their way. However, with nature at a low ebb, we believe that there is an opportunity to rethink our approach, to rethink nature conservation. And in fact, this thinking has been underway for at least 15 years. And this is the topic of our book, Rewilding, the Radical New Science of Ecological Recovery. And we felt the need for this book because in the media, you know, the topic of rewilding is often focused on wolves and returning large carnivores to the wild. And what's happened is that this is a misrepresentation, effectively. It's not wrong, but it's only one side of the story. And what's happening, and we've seen this in the UK, is that it's starting to alienate local people. So we've produced this book with the aim of providing a balanced and in-depth overview of the science, policy and practice of rewilding. So I'm going to hand over to Paul, who's going to build on that picture for you.
Yeah, hi everybody. Sorry I can't meet you all in person, but lovely to you know, be together online. So I think for me, I was just talking actually to a couple of people in the chat room. I got into rewilding 15 years ago, and actually after a period when I'd been working on the Sumatran frontier, and then I'd gone to Oxford to teach, and I was a bit shaken up by working on the frontier, seeing so much rainforest destruction, and you know, I was a bit down. And also my students, actually, they were really demanding a more sort of hopeful, optimistic conservation, saying that we don't want to study just to be almost like Canute, you know, defending an ever declining wildlife. And that's what got me looking around for where is the innovation, where's the cutting edge, and that's where I came across rewilding. And it's what I love about rewilding, and what I love about both the science and practice is this sort of notion of awakening. That it's currently, I don't know, surprising you and sort of challenging fixed ways of thinking and so forth. So I'm just going to sort of give you a little bit of a flavour of some of the sort of key ideas in rewilding science. And this one on the side is the sort of strapline for it, is that nature to survive, nature to rebound, nature to recovery, it needs messy chaos. Now, in scientific terms, it's now sort of settled into this understanding that the sort of health of ecosystems, or the dynamism of ecosystems, the processes of evolution, they come from interactions between three key domains or dimensions. One of those is what we call trophic complexity, and this is a sort of scientific term. You'll know it as the sort of web of life, or the food web. You know, all of these interconnections between animals, which can be, you know, they can be go up into the sky, down into the earth, sort of these, you know, big networks of interconnections. And then those are interacting and they sort of play into each other with another dimension of ecosystems called random disturbance or natural disturbance. So things like, you know, a braiding river, or a tree which falls down, or even a bit of fire, just things which are constantly keeping disturbance going. And then the third aspect, which is really key to these new understandings of ecosystems, is the important, and this is one that's been around for longer actually, is the importance of connectivity, the ability of organisms to move across space, you know, be this the migration, we were talking about swifts in the chat room, or be it, you know, seeds of plants, you know, being carried around by, you know, in the manes of horses or in the coats of cattle. But when we look at the countryside around us, or the landscapes around us now, they tend to look like this, except in a very few places. So if you just bear in mind those three things I talked about the web of life, the natural disturbance, and connectivity. This is a place called Coke Hill in Oxfordshire, and I was up there one evening last week trying to listen for quail, and I did hear quail actually. But in 2.5 hours up there, me and my mate Steve, we saw 10 species of birds, but probably less than 40 individual birds. And this for me is where, you know, we talk about the nature emergency. This is it on the ground. But partly you can see why, because if you look at this landscape, first of all, there's no natural disturbance in it. There's no, not really any connectivity in it. You know, those little patches of woodland, well, how can you get in between those? You know, there's barriers in it, and it's very highly managed. And then, you know, as I say, there's hardly any birds in it. But one of the fantastic advances we've had in ecology over the last maybe 10 years, and partly because of technology, is we now have a much better understanding of what ecosystems were like 15, 20,000 years ago. And we now, you know, realize that actually Europe looked like this. You know, the images we have of Africa, that was the image in Europe as well, of megafaunas, grasses and megafauna co-evolving over 4 million years, interacting with, you know, rock faces, with trees, with natural dynamics. And through all of these interactions, creating lots and lots of microhabitats which just get, well, lots of places for things to live and evolve. So you had these abundant natures there. But now we realize that as the second wave of human expansion came out of Africa and into Europe and across into the Americas between 10,000 years ago, first of all, a lot of our ancestors, they hunted these megafauna, and they just weren't savvy, if you like, if that's the way to say. They were easy to hunt, and because they had low reproduction rates over about, we don't quite know how long, but over, you know, hundreds of years or millennia, they disappeared. And that had profound effects. We might want to discuss this afterwards, but one of the interesting things is that they may have had climatic effects. So we may have had a first global warming 25 years ago caused by human, 20 years ago, 15 to 10,000 years, 10 to 15,000 years ago. And then we constantly went through these processes of taming some of the animals, taming the countryside, ordering the countryside, and now basically extracting all the profit we can, it seems to be, out of the countryside at times, or out of nature. So we've had this sort of ongoing downgrading of ecosystems. But the interesting thing is that, you know, in the UK, again, this is a picture just, I was out birding on Sunday of my local river. To us, this looks rather beautiful. You know, it's a classic English scene. But now when we understand it from this perspective of history, we realise that actually these natures are quite badly downgraded. And one of the ideas here, which is a key idea in rewilding, is the phenomena of the shifting baseline syndrome. Some of you may have come across this before. If any of you are into fisheries management, you'll have come across this idea. But it's the idea that all of us in our youth, you know, in our childhood and our youth, we engage with nature. And the nature we encounter, we assume that to be natural. And we assume that the natural abundance, the habitats the way they are, we sort of assume that's how it should be. But of course, every new generation is encountering a degraded nature. So every generation, we gradually come to accept and value a more degraded nature, until I think where we are now, where it's pretty serious. But it's this strange thing, and we could talk about this, that we seem to have as a species or as a culture, we, society, whatever we want to say, we seem to have internalized ecological impoverishment in our policy, in our laws, in our institutions, in our culture, in our media representations. And the key idea about rewilding is how might we get out of that? So with this long-term perspective, especially if you start reading something about the megafaunas and God, the planet as it once used to be, it's hard not to despair, and it's hard not to feel pretty down and pretty angry about it all. But this is not quite the rewilding ethos, or the ethos amongst rewilding practitioners. So there's quite a pragmatism amongst a lot of the rewilding practitioners, which I know, which is sort of saying, well, you know, we are where we are. There's no point attributing blame or feeling guilty. But what would happen? What could nature become if we took our foot off nature? If we actually gave it the space and helped it to start recovering? And I think we've all seen this every spring. Nature is a force. It does come back. And we're seeing this in rewilding areas around Europe, that once you take your foot off it, once we move back, or once we enable it to come back, it sort of rebounds, sometimes slower and sometimes differently, but in unexpected ways. And I think that the ethos of rewilding, as I say, is like, why don't we just explore what would happen and what natures would appear, and actually explore that journey of living with a recovering nature rather than living with a declining nature. And fundamentally, I think this is a cultural choice for us all. And it's a cultural choice which, as Cain said in his introduction, now it's a great time to be thinking about this, this choice.
So, you know, I think, you know, we're talking to a converted audience in some respects. We're talking to an audience who understands rebellion and understands the value of rebellion. But we have to also reflect on the view that history shows us that rebellions need to be more than a just compelling vision and inspirational vision. And I think one of the lessons taken from this, that in order for lasting change to occur, it's really important that rebellions need more than a vision. And you know, this was seen to a certain extent in the Egyptian Spring Uprising. There needs to be a clear set of principles, and I think with that clear set of principles, that enables strong leadership to occur, and also that can be backed by calls to action. And those calls to action are simultaneously radical yet achievable. And we need to find a way that we both embrace radicalism, achievable outcomes, and we also need to kind of learn from the hard lessons. There have been lots of hard lessons in rewilding. So the good news is that in terms of rewilding, the principles are starting to settle, and definitely the hard lessons are being learnt. So Paul has been pretty integral to developing these rewilding principles on behalf of the the European Rewilding Network. And these have also been adopted into the Global Charter for Rewilding the Earth. And they're a set of kind of 11 principles, ranging from those that are focused on providing hope and purpose, those that allow nature to lead, and those also through to working together and recognizing the fact that people are key. And I think another really important aspect about this is that the principles, these principles are of the moment, you know, recognizes that people's mental health and well-being need to be accommodated within these sorts of principles. It recognizes that nature has to lead and needs to be able to work at scale, for example, and also recognizes that all scenarios that are considered have their own unique and valuable context.
I think just to add there, Ken, we also felt, you know, within the European rewilding movement, that it was just really important just to be transparent and open with everybody about what we were doing. I mean, you know, as you guys are, you've got your three claims up there, and we felt that putting out these principles, which they came together, you know, they were sort of, what do you call it, came from workshops and so forth, and putting them out there just so that people could you know, either hold us to account for them or understand what rewilding movement was about. So there was a lot about hoping that through the principles they would build trust and wider trust and transparency, perhaps, and also, you know, connect with people.
So I think in the next sort of part of the talk, we wanted, Paul and I have sort of had a chat about it, and we wanted to kind of share some what we think are clear calls to action that are relevant to the UK. The hope is that they're relatively easy to understand, and certainly they will encompass the rewilding principles. So the first one is related to living rivers, and I think, you know, rivers are very dynamic systems and they respond to change very quickly. You know, we know this. We've been involved with some of the beaver release trials in the UK, and the rate of change within the structure of our river systems is dramatic, compelling, and the results are easy to see. But as we know, the rivers are the lifeblood of the countryside, but have been degraded, you know, significantly throughout Europe, but particularly in the UK. I mean, you know, we're being fairly blunt about it, but in the UK, effectively, we've got large drains crossing our countryside. You know, this is resulting in flooding. This is resulting in loss of habitat. This is resulting in loss of species. So what we want to encourage, the call to action, is we need to start allowing our rivers to follow their natural form. We need to understand that they are hugely valuable refuges for wildlife, and they enable nature to establish a really quick, you know, and rapid rate. The image you can see here is from Gelderse Poort in the Netherlands, and this is a project developed by Ark Nature back in the 1980s, I think it was, and this came from a collaboration with the brick industry, and Ark Nature and the brick companies, they came to an agreement that the brick companies could take the substrate, the clay from the river, convert those into bricks, and then, you know, profit from that activity. But they needed to do it in a way that understood the ecological processes and the ecological systems required to create the dynamic environment that you can see in front of you.
Ken, can I just add on that? This was an interesting one, because being in the Netherlands, they had summer dikes along the river. So they had the river in the channel, then the summer dike, and then the winter dike. And of course, because of summer flooding, loads of silt had been built up inside between the two dikes, and that had you know, just filled up the old braided, meandering river. And the deal there was with the brick company. They recovered and restored the old meandering riverbed, and that's what financed the whole thing. It took, well, it's only just finished actually, so I think it took 18 or 20 years, but it was all done in stages, which was a rather lovely story to follow.
And unexpected things happen, which was, you know, this is the story that's absolutely fascinating from a rewilding perspective. You know, of all things to turn up, sturgeon appeared in the river, which was, nobody thought that was going to happen. Beaches appeared along the riverside where a variety of overwintering birds could nest and sort of roost, and people could go and enjoy. They can use them as swimming spaces,
sunbathing. Yeah.
Sunbathing. Not to mention the fact that the town downstream of the river no longer flooded. So the kind of the benefits of allowing rivers to do their natural thing and give them space to breathe is a really strong call to action. The next one is kind of related to that, because obviously rivers are, as I mentioned, the lifeblood of our countryside. But connecting landscapes, there are so many opportunities of improving our landscapes in the UK, and some of this is happening in Europe already. But we've been very kind of a little bit obsessed with putting up fences and, you know, damming things and putting weirs in places. And we've been building roads and we've been building towns. And this is all, you know, this is all progress in inverted commas, but it's not been done with a sound set of principles behind it. So what we're actively encouraging now is, you know, take down the fences. There are projects down in Dorset where there are plans to remove fences between national nature reserves. It's to ensure that we incorporate eco bridges into our large infrastructure schemes. And we don't need as many dams and weirs as there are. Some of the projects in Europe are removing vast numbers of dams and other structures in rivers to allow the free passage of fish. We need to allow our livestock to move freely and let them do what they do best. And I think that's sort of hands over nicely to the next one for Paul.
Yeah, just to add on that, I found out a little bit of information this week because I was talking to someone who's an expert in sort of river modelling, and I hadn't realised that in these small barriers in rivers, which of course disrupt fish flow, but they also disrupt the sort of natural meandering dynamics or the sedimentation in river. Apparently, about 20% of our barriers in rivers in the UK are not needed anymore. They're just they had a purpose ages ago and they've just been left there. And these are sort of some of these things which may be the easy wins to start getting these rivers moving. Or, as Cain said, there's huge amounts of fencing which is no longer used in the countryside, which could, which is a barrier. Things get trapped in it. Anyhow, I wanted to get back onto my favourite topic of large herbivores, and I think something we've learned from rewilding is that if we bring the herbivores, the cattle, the horses, back out of their fields and sheds and allow them to reform herds and follow natural grazing patterns, this has a huge impact on nature recovery. And partly it's because a large herbivore, or a herd of large herbivores, be these cattle or horses, or they can be deer to some extent as well, they fulfill those three dimensions of the ecosystem, which if you remember, I put in that little, we had in that little triangular graphic. So first of all, they create natural disturbance. So, if we think of this cow we're looking at here and its fellows, it will gnaw away at a tree and, create some scarring on that. It might trample down some vegetation, break it. It might, it'll have the disturbance along where they walk. They'll create wallows, and then they've got their dung coming, the feces and all of that, which creates different nutrient patterns. So they just complicate, make messy and complex habitats, and that gives lots of things a place to live. Equally, and this would be a longer, if you like, call to action. If they're allowed to die, their carcasses are a massive food resource, and you have something we've lost in the UK is what we call the scavenger ecologies. All of the animals, the insects, the flies, the stuff which just lives around carcasses, and these used to be very important in the winter. Of course, we do have some of that. If any of you come out of London on the M40 to Oxford, you'll see plenty of red kites on a very simple scavenger ecology system, feeding on roadkill, but that's perhaps not quite the vision. We could aspire to more, I think, is the point there. But one of the really interesting things, and maybe a great opportunity in Europe, is because unlike North America to some extent, or South America, we didn't wipe out all of our herbivores. And there's a longer story behind this, which I won't go into now. But when we think of the old large or the megafauna guild of the herbivore guild of Europe back in 5,000-10,000 years ago, you can see that over on the left of this slide. And what we actually did as humans, we brought a set of them out of the wild and domesticated them. So our wild cattle, the auroch, is extinct in the wild, but then actually it's not extinct in terms of the animal, we just call it a cow rather than an auroch. Our horses are extinct in the wild, but actually within Europe there's 37 populations of feral horses, which are so old that when we're looking at the DNA, they're not that far off what the what the so-called extinct wild horse is. So this gives a really interesting idea, which we can do in Europe, is we can reassemble these guilds, these combinations of herbivores in their numbers and in their combinations, which exist before we had these major downgrading effects on the ecosystem. And we could do that in two ways. One of the ways has already been done, and it's been done in the Netherlands, where they have de-domesticated cattle and horses. And this is really, if you're into this is in the book a bit, if you're into the science on this, they're using ancient DNA to guide backbreeding. So it says, you know, basically if we domesticated an animal the one way, we can actually backbreed it. It won't be the same, but it will play the same ecological role. So that's one way of doing it. Another way which we might consider in the UK and in the agricultural bill, there could be an opportunity to do this, is to actually work with farmers, communities, if they're interested, to restore a form of extensive grazing where we're mixing up native breeds, these older breeds which have the functional role and don't need, you know, highly fertilized grass, with species of deer, and sort of having these systems which are part productive and part wild, sort of hybrid systems. And again, these ideas I really like because they're lovely ideas to play with, but they also give these imaginings of how we might actually address the nature emergency, addressing it through you know, a different way of doing things, but a way which is drawing inspiration from the past to shape the future. One of the, I mean, you lot must think about this quite a lot, about how do you bring about transformational change? And how do you bring about when, you know, quite understandably, maybe societies and governments and institutions are resistant. You know, they fear widespread change. It unsettles everything. Okay, I know we're in a moment, you know, a time in history where all of that has been unsettled. But I think one of the things we've learned from Rewilding is that demonstration projects are a really good way of affecting transformational change. And this is particularly in Europe. We haven't really got to this place yet in the UK. And the idea is that although we might, you know, collectively people might resist change, we all love funky experiments. We all love cool places to go and visit, to talk about, to discuss, to take inspiration from, to be unsettled by, and whatever. I mean, the Eden Project, those of you who remember that when it started up, is a classic example of that. So one of the ideas about how we might start doing rewilding, this is, you know, this is at a sort of more national scale, is to perhaps start having a network of experimental rewilding areas where we start, you know, putting into place some of the principles we've just been talking about, where people can come and engage, they can have their input, and we can sort of work with nature to shape different ways of doing things. And then the theory there, and this is what's happened in the Netherlands, is that you create this other, which, if you like, the status quo, the institutions, the people who want to keep things as they are, they can't ignore. They can either say, oh, that's a lot of rubbish, but then they have to justify it, or they can say, oh, you know, that's actually quite good, and start making that transition towards them. So personally, I'm quite a fan of this idea of progress through demonstration projects.
And you'll probably all be very familiar with the site that this image is based on, which is the Knepp Estate, which is obviously one of the first kind of landownings in the UK that have started to engage with the idea of a demonstration site.
And they really illustrate the point in terms of the amount of interest they've got.
Yeah.
Are you finishing here, or was I?
I think you were, yeah. I can.
Hey, so, I mean, thanks for listening to us. It's, and we're really looking forward to, you know, to the discussion and hearing your thoughts on this. And the question we thought we might just throw out to leave and, you know, to prompt the discussion is the question of, are we ready for rewilding? I mean, the science is there. There's a lot of energy for it, but really, are we ready to go that step? And it throws up some interesting, I don't know whether they're conundrums or unsettling or things we'd have to think. First of all, you know, from a nature conservation point of view, we in the UK, we have managed nature quite carefully, you know, in our RSPB reserves, in our wildlife trust reserves, in our urban reserves. We've been managing it. So could we actually transition to sort of, you know, doing the bits which we need to do to kickstart nature, the management, but then just put our hands in our pockets and let nature lead, even if it does things which we don't think are quite right from our perspective of what's right and wrong from nature. Could we accept that nature, a rewilded nature, would look like, probably not look like much we already know. It might look a bit like the New Forest in places. But, you know, we have this such impression of our Lake District, our South Downs, you know, these iconic landscapes. Could we accept a nature and welcome a nature which doesn't fit our, you know, our cultural images of what the countryside should look like? And, you know, can we embrace that messiness in our landscapes? To be honest, when we talk with farmers, this is a really difficult one for farmers, that they take a lot of pride in keeping their land looking neat and tidy, and so forth. So could we embrace chaos, and could we really embrace uncertainty in our natural landscapes? And perhaps a fourth one is, could we find a way to live alongside large herbivores, which aren't divided into individual animals and kept in fields, but which are allowed to live a social life in herds and interact and shape areas of nature? Could we have those areas?
So that's the end of our talk. We hope you enjoyed it, and we're very much looking forward to what you think. We hope you've got ideas that will stimulate this debate, and we're looking forward to having a discussion with you. Thank you.
Brilliant, wonderful. Thank you very much, Paul and Cain. That was fascinating. At one point, we were going to go and have a break, but actually it was too interesting. So I said, let's keep going. So what we're going to do, if that's okay, I'm going to put everyone back into breakout rooms, and we'll give everyone a chance to have a chat, talk through some of those questions, use the facilities, if you want, and we'll come back again. Make it about 5 minutes. We'll go through to 8 o'clock, and then we'll come back. I'll open up the chat, and then we'll get people to put questions in, and you can unmute yourselves and ask questions as well and comment. That's okay. So we had to manage this quite well. We still have 70 people online, which is fantastic. Thank you very much for staying with us. So I'll open up the rooms, 5 minutes, and then we'll come back and we'll carry on with the Q&A. That's okay. But thank you very much, Cain and Paul. That was fantastic. Right, there we go. All being invited to the rooms now, so you should be able to join. Okay, so I'm closing out the breakout rooms now. Everyone has 60 seconds to come back, but I know there's quite a lot of people still hanging around. So give everyone another kind of 50 seconds, and then we'll come back and we'll open up for the chat. Cain and Paul, I'm just going to take the screen share back. So there we go. Questions. Brilliant. So we've got everyone back in the room now, I do believe. So thank you very much. Hopefully that was enough time. Apologies if you were in a chat room by yourself. I was trying to move people around so that everyone was actually managed to join a chat room and had a conversation. So I've opened up the chat now. So if people want to put in questions, and then Cain and Paul will kind of work our way through those. I've also, thank you, Ben, that's a good point. I'm going to enable people to unmute themselves as well if they want to ask a question out loud. So if you should now have the ability to unmute yourself if someone wants to shout out a question. If we've got loads of people shouting out all at once, we'll revert back to the chat. But either shout out or put questions in the chat, and we'll go from there. You should be able to unmute yourself now. Shout if not.
Matthew here.
Thank you, Matt.
When they were talking about decay, would it help if we got over our sense here in the urban area of burying our cats or burying our dog when they dies and just throw them into the bushes and then because in our society we just want to bury everything, don't we? We want to get rid of it, get it out of the way, get it out of our sight. But we need to change the way we behave in things when it comes to dead pets, for example.
Well, I think you're touching on quite a key point here, which is our kind of aversion to the idea of dead animals. I mean, I think, from chucking out dead cats and dogs into the street, I'm not sure how that necessarily would kind of help engage with the principle of rewilding, other than it does expose people to the reality that the cycle of life involves death. And there's a lot of debate around some of the earlier projects like the Ostwasserplasm with animals dying and being left alongside the sort of train line that passed the site. And these are the hurdles that we as a society would need to overcome, or at least embrace or educate ourselves about, in order to be able to properly allow that kind of that kind of process to happen.
Yeah, just to add that, I think we do have quite a sanitised view in the UK, and I talk about this. Could we accept death as a lingering thing in the countryside? Not only the carcasses, but actually seeing animals die, and that's a really difficult thing. So when when I was talking about the this idea of, should we allow part of rewilding and that natural grazing would have cattle living living natural lives, but part of that life is that they go out of condition. And then, but culturally, the idea of a cow or a horse, going out of condition, get the vet out straight away. There'd be massive pressure on that.
Yeah.
But actually, it's interesting because when I've been looking at them in the winter on these farm places, it's interesting. They do go into a sort of torpor, so you don't know whether they're in pain like we would be or not. But overcoming that that cultural barrier, is that the right way to talk it? I think that's a long way off. However, that's where I go back again to these demonstration sites, because the crazy thing is that people pay a lot of money to go on safari in Africa and see lion kills and see the vultures coming in, and that's sort of like, wow, and if we did have these rewilded areas where animals were living a more natural life, and we were starting to see the ravens and the eagles coming in, maybe that would help us to sort of start reassessing those things. Love to hear what other people think on that one, though. It's a
Yeah.
cracking one for debate.
I don't think we recommend you throwing your cats into the street just yet, though, Matthew.
No, there's a lot of regulations about these things. So
I'm gonna ask for slightly more succinct questions because we've got a lot of questions coming into the chat. That's all right, guys. But yeah, it's really great. Thank you very much, everyone, for putting stuff in the chat. So first two questions from Agabert. Hope I've said that right. And Tara. Basically, two questions. How can we bring the messiness to rewilding in the city? And is rewilding relevant in any way to domestic sized gardening? So obviously we would have thought that we've got a lot of gardeners online. So interesting to think about gardeners as well.
Well, maybe I could have a go at that one, because I actually started my career in urban conservation in Manchester back in the 1980s. And I mean, it was so cool there because, you know, in those days that along the River Mersey in the south, it was it was tipland. I mean, and there were still exposed tips. And there we didn't call it rewilding, and it was a quite static nature, but we brought countryside back into the cities. So actually, in places like the Lee Valley in London, there has actually been a heritage of all this already happening in the 1980s. The question, what is the next step? What could we do now to bring in more dynamic nature? So let me take the cities for the first, and these are only ideas out there. One of the things is we're talking about dynamics and disturbance in it. One of the ideas is about pop-up habitats. So it tends to be that in cities, there's always places where, I don't know, they've ripped down a building and they've run out of money, and it's going to be 2 or 3 years before they actually build something new in there. And this idea of sort of getting this sort of spatial awareness and maybe, of where these patches of land are, which are vacant for 2 or 3 years, and then doing something just to kickstart those. So you've got these, these initial flushes of grasses and bushes, the fast growing stuff, which can actually support quite a lot of wildlife. That might be one way to start thinking about it, where we're not looking for fixed things, we're moving with the dynamics of cities, and if you like, the dynamics of the property markets, or and the other one, which I think maybe this is a bit fanciful, but I think it's an interesting one to look at. Some people have talked about, and it's been done somewhere, is to start looking at flat roofs. So a lot of cities have that, 1960s, 70s build where they put the flat roofs on. And actually, you can start looking for these on Google Maps as well. And the possibilities that we could find, building owners who would say, yeah, we're not doing much on the top of the roofs. Yeah, all right. Why don't you start rewilding the roofs and then getting these sort of multi-dimensional urban areas? So that's a couple of ideas which might spark some discussion.
I would probably sort of suggest to people as well that contacting your local councils, and also where there are big construction projects happening. Oh yeah. There are some there are some challenges out there at the moment, like the big Biodiversity Challenge, where they're encouraging big contractors to go above and beyond, and there are organisations now that are starting to really try and embrace ways in which they can put out, things like Paul was describing, even if it's just temporary habitat, like the containers with green roofs on top, providing extra tree planting, providing areas that provide connectivity. So trying to find out about these different schemes and contacting organisations like the Chartered Institute for Ecology, and finding out what you can do. There's some great advice and guidance out there.
Brilliant. But I also think you can just it's almost like a bit of urban exploring, but just looking at what's going on in the dynamics of the city and how you can take advantage of that, and thinking creatively, I think, as always, which I know you guys are brilliant at with all the process you do.
Thanks for that. I think that answers some of the next couple of questions, actually, in terms of what happens next. How do we move rewilding forward? Thank you, Louisa. And Victoria really enjoyed her breakout room buddies, so that's good to know. Microforesting, Agabert again. Can we use microforesting? And is that different to rewilding?
Can you just explain a bit more what you mean by microforesting?
I don't know. So,
who was it? Could you shout out a little bit, just so we're on the same wavelength?
Yeah, you could unmute yourself, Agabert, and ask if that's okay.
Yeah, sorry, my name's Anne Egbert, so that's
okay.
that name. But yeah. No, it was something that I heard about. I think it was an article in The Guardian, and it was something that was developed by a Japanese ecologist who talked about the idea that provided you plant a rich enough variety of different sort of indigenous plants, if you like, then you end up with something that kind of replicates a fast-growing miniature forest. Yeah, so that's the principle, rather than the monocultural planting that we usually encounter in landscaping, perhaps on the side of motorways or whatever. But I'm just wondering, there's so many bits of green in the city that just seem to get mown, and maybe microforesting on those sort of small patches of land might be a sensible way to link up, the corridors that you're talking about.
So I mean, I think we're in discussion around these things all the time, and it's about engaging with natural regeneration principles. And sometimes there are areas, and particularly within urban areas, where they have been isolated for some time. The seed bank and things like that are not strong enough to allow for habitat to kind of establish quickly, or in a way that avoids invasive species taking over, or whatever it might be. So there is some argument for encouraging kind of, I suppose we refer to it as sort of seeding. So you would introduce, and I think Ben kind of referred to some of this earlier, seeding areas with native species or a mix of species that are pioneer species that then evolve into habitat types that are much more resilient, a lot more kind of healthy, and yeah, allowing and then stepping back and allowing nature to kind of run its course. And quite often that's the bit that we find people struggle with. They're quite happy to sit and watch it for maybe a year, maybe 2 years, but after 3, 4, 5 years, the habitat starts to become a bit more dynamic, and things appear like bramble and nettles that people aren't quite so keen on. So yeah, I would agree there is some scope there for what you refer to as microforesting, but it does need to be in context as well. It does need to be in the right place and based on science, not just kind of random to a certain extent.
Can I just say something? Can I just say something about microforests? Because I think one of the sort of principles of it is that you are planting many more trees much closer than you normally would, and that effectively there's about 3 trees per square meter, or there may be shrub, undergrowth and tree, and there's also lots of mycorrhizal fungi and that type of thing introduced, so that you actually get this sort of synergy, I think, and it grows incredibly rapidly and can create a sort of a biodiversity hotspot basically. But it's obviously quite different to rewilding, I guess.
I mean, so planting trees, those days I mentioned when I was in Manchester in the 1980s, Manchester had it was going to plant 1 million trees, and it did, but it used what we call block planting, which was planting very close together. So the sort of idea you're just saying. Now, one of the problems with trees is that it's really good for the startup phase. They protect each other, they suppress weeds, and maybe, as you're suggesting, they can also build the soil mycorrhiza. But if they're not managed and thinned out, they just go straight up into these little lollipops, and then you get woodlands which have very little structural diversity in the woodlands, so there's not much underneath them. There's a bit of stuff on the canopy, and they're not particularly good ecologically. So although that strategy, if that's the sort of process we're saying, it's great for starting, it has quite long-term maintenance. And of course, what Manchester never told its citizens, that, yeah, we're going to plant 1 million trees, but actually we're going to have to cut down 900,000 of them to create a decent woodland over 25 years. That wasn't in the messaging. We all like the 1 million tree bit of it.
I mean, there's a continuation of that sort of theme in the sense that with a planting scheme that involves trees, absolutely, but understanding those supporting shrubs and plants that actually allow standard trees to become established in a much more natural setting. So planting trees within a kind of a sort of dead hedging kind of environment, or within an area planted with thorny scrub, that allows the trees to then grow strong without overgrazing by or browsing by deer, that kind of thing. And so there is an argument for that, because you do plant some of the scrub at much closer densities, but the trees themselves are actually quite separated so that they've got growing space.
So I'm going to carry on. Thanks very much, guys. Caroline says, how do we change the culture of neatness and the English countryside to look different to capability brown? Because you mentioned that in your talk as well, how farmers like to keep things nice and neat.
Yeah, I don't think we quite know on that because, of course, we can't tell farmers what to do. It's about them thinking. I mean, a lot of it, sorry, I'm going to bang on about demonstration projects. It is partly about having other models which they look at. So quite a lot of farmers are now going to the NEP estate and seeing, I mean, some of the old ones say, oh, this is how we farm was when I was a young guy. So sort of almost that reminding of what the landscape was like. I think there's a lot of policy in relation to this. So a lot of the tidiness comes through, the policy, which requires certain things to be happened. Unfortunately, mechanization allows them to be really tidy. You just you can pile along with your tractor, and you can bring contractors in, and you can specify it. So that's talking to you about all the problems really, and the solutions of this. I mean, I think the first solution is just talking about it and awareness and showing different models and perhaps changing some of the policy incentive structures. Yeah. But I apologise, that's not a particularly satisfactory answer, because I think that shift in culture from tidiness to messiness amongst many farmers, it's, they take pride in this, and they think that they should, that a lot of them are thinking about if they're passing it on to their onto their children or whatever, you don't leave a farm messy for them, you leave it in good order, So I think there's a big cultural shift there.
Yeah, and that sort of just answers sort of Lynn's question here. It says, are people buying land together and rewilding it together? Any projects with good models that we should know about? So you mentioned the NEP estates. Whereabouts is that? Is that Suffolk or?
Yeah, so the NEP estate is, so broadly, and came out broadly what's happening in the UK at the moment is that there's lots and lots of talk about rewilding. There's not much action on the ground. And partly that's because, of course, to rewild, you need land, and land is very expensive to buy, or it's controlled by things. So the case of the NEP estate was, it's a hereditary estate, if you like, and the owners, had the wherewithal, they could decide what they wanted to do on their estate. Many other states actually have tenant farmers where, you don't have that flexibility. There is one project by Heel Rewilding, which is sort of doing a mega crowdfunding campaign to actually buy land to rewild. And then within some of the more progressive NGOs, we're starting to see some sort of, some experimentation going on with rewilding principles on their nature reserves. But there's actually an argument that that's not necessarily a good place to do it, because our existing nature reserves, the last refuges of wildlife and species, sources of species and so forth, they've been highly managed and they're quite small. And rewilding is a bit unknown and a bit risky. So we might want to keep those as they are, rewild on new areas, on areas we can get, and then the two start interacting, and one's a sort of source of animals for the newly emerging the newly recovering ecosystems. Can you have a thought on that?
Yeah, I think I mean there is going to be a bit of a potential short-term shift change in the way in which some of these organisations that Paul refers to are going to have to think about their land, because I think there is a post-COVID reality, which is that there's not as much money going around, and so with the ideas around rewilding and the principles that are being developed at the moment, I think there is an opportunity to talk to local conservation organisation, landowners, National Trust, whoever it might be, to actually say, are there areas within their landownings that could be allowed to kind of be put to a wilder state and allowed to kind of develop more naturally? So there is an opportunity, I think, there to start engaging in those sorts of conversations.
Yeah. I mean, there are other Wild Ennerdale up in the Lake District is a good example of a larger project, and there's Trees for Life in Scotland, which are doing this. And we are starting to see models where estates are being bought by, rewilded-minded investors who are interested in, you know, not just getting a financial return from the money. They don't want to lose all the money, but they want to, you know, invest in rewilding. So we are seeing some movements in there, but you know, we all know the state of land in the UK in terms of its ownership and its cost. So rewilding is a bit of space.
I think that's the challenge. And then just go back, I'm actually working on a project which Ken and Paul know about, exactly that. An entrepreneur has bought some land and looking at rewilding it, and there is interesting opportunities there. I actually also know of a particular finance institution that's potentially looking at that as well as investing in property, investing in kind of land to offset as well. So that's quite.
You could probably mention Rewilding Britain as well, which is obviously quite central to discussions with quite a lot of landowners, and they're working towards the development of a national network so that all expertise and knowledge can be pooled and shared, so that more of these kind of pioneering projects can take place.
I think that's qualified what I just said. There's been a lot of talk, but not much action in the UK. But actually, where we're now at, there's a lot of talk, and there's a heck of a lot of planning going on at the moment, and preparation. So I think we could come back in 5 years and think, Christ, there's quite a lot going on, because people are really getting active in the UK to think about how they can overcome these challenges of the cost of land, but also the policy constraints on what you can and can't do.
Brilliant.
So, sorry to throw one more kind of point. One of the I suppose one of the inspirations, and this is quite I think important for us in the UK. One of the inspirations for a lot of these rewilding sites in the UK and indeed in Europe is the New Forest, and the way in which the land has been managed over many sort of hundreds of years, and the way the woodlands and the pastures have developed. It's a very, it's one of our oldest examples of what we would now call a rewilded site. So well worth a look.
So I'm just going to go back to Peter's question in terms of landowners. Just to let you know, we're still on the questions that came in at 8:02, so we've got lots of questions to get through. So everybody's still on. We'll go through. We can carry on going as long as
we'll give shorter answers, man.
Happy to answer questions. But Peter asked, landowners whose land has lost nutrients, would they benefit more from allowing the cattle to roam, regenerate, and restore the soils, or could that be a negative thing?
Yeah, that's absolutely the theory. But actually, allowing the natural grazing approach is a very good way of recovering soil health. And the science isn't quite there yet, as we looked at, but it's, if we want to sequester carbon, our best model might be a mix of, the traditional forest, the wood pasture, have grasslands with cattle grazing, restoring the soil health, and then sequestering carbon, and, have groves of trees which are also sequestering carbon.
I would also kind of add to that we also need to be aware of, there's a lot of talk about planting trees and the benefits for sequestering carbon, and I know that's a thing. However, there are benefits of recognizing that low nutrient soils do support wildflower meadows, and if those habitats are allowed to develop, then it's possible that is as good as, if not a better, carbon sink. It depends on lots of parameters, but it shouldn't be forgotten, I think, in the discussion around whether trees, more and more trees should be planted, or in fact whether we should be considering wildflower meadows as a suitable alternative.
One of the arguments here on rewilding, and if we just imagine these wood pasture systems with some herbivores knocking about, just very simply, is that they provide a bundle of benefits. So as well as the carbon sequestration, you get great recreational areas. You get areas which might create other ecosystem benefits, such as pulling pollutants out the air and what have you. So rewilding, because it's a system, it doesn't do one thing brilliantly, like maybe just planting loads of trees, but it does a whole set of things well.
Fantastic, brilliant. Thank you very much. Interestingly, just a point aside, we had last month we had Chris Goodall talking about a plan for net zero carbon Britain, and he was saying that about 30% of the UK is kind of grazing, sort of on sheep and cattle, and actually his view was putting in reforesting up to about 30%, which is only about equal to the rest of Europe, frankly. So there's interesting conversations around what that should be. Can
I ask a question about reforesting?
Yes, is that a double hand up? Specific point.
Yeah, I guess so. To me, I guess reforesting by humans, I would consider that wasn't really a principle of rewilding, and Isabella Tree kind of makes that point, I think, in her book, where you're not allowing the magic of rewilding to happen if you plant by hand, because you're not allowing succession, you're not allowing trees to gravitate to where they would like to go, and opening up spaces. And it seems like a lot of companies and businesses are using that opportunity to say, let's plant loads of trees, and it isn't actually a rich, diverse habitat that they're creating. They're creating plastic coned trees that then don't really get looked after, often die. So yeah, what do you think on that?
Yeah, so when we think what isn't rewilding, which is always a good one. So there is a group who say that rewilding is passive rewilding, that you just let nature sort itself out, basically, so you just leave it and allow it to go in the other way. There's another group, of which I'm very much part in this camp, to be honest about it, which recognises that starting conditions shape or steer the trajectory of ecosystems. So that group says, well, look, if it's good and we just let it go. But there may be many situations where the ecosystems have been so downgraded that we want to intervene to set up some starting conditions so it develops either quicker or in a particular trajectory towards it. So the river rewilding one example is a case in part of that, where it was saying we're not just going to take the summer dikes out, or we're not just going to stop farming in the summer dikes and see what happens. We will invest in excavating the old river channels so that the starting conditions were in there as well. So on that line, and when we're going on to the theme of tree planting, you could say, well, if it's an arable field or a pasture and we just let it go, great. But actually, we could actually say, well, let's just get the starting conditions, the basic starting conditions in, which would be some grasslands, some shrublands, maybe some tree groves, so that it just starts with that sort of structural way, and then it will go in a particular, it'll go off in a particular direction. So I think it's the time when you intervene with rewilding, but the basic principle is letting nature steer. So once you set some starting conditions, you let it go. But at some stage, you might need to intervene again if it's coming into conflict with other things which are important. Because there's always trade-offs in complex societies.
Yeah, I would probably just echo that, but sort of suggest it's from a basis of ecosystem resilience and building that into the system, so that an arable field is not very resilient. For example, it's very prone to erosion and invasion from non-native species, that kind of thing. So building in some resilience allows the habitat to establish, allows the mycorrhizae to form, for example, and these are really healthy kind of activities. So just standing back is not always the most appropriate decision, I would suggest. It's
interesting, one of the first things that happens in a lot of rewilding sites is that you get in and you have to block all the drains. just to reset the natural hydrology of a field, or you go in and you take all the fences out, those sort of things. So there's nearly always something you need to do on starting conditions. The lovely thing about NEP is that they had different starting conditions on it, and if you go there, it's gone in different ways on it, and that certainly creates diversity to the landscape.
Brilliant. I'm going to try and bring a few comments together because we've got some similar comments around. So Caroline says, I was shocked to see the Yorkshire Dales last year when all I could see, apart from all I could see was a small area of heather heaths was fields and roads. And then Fouquet says, would actually, areas like huge areas of low biodiversity, such as the Yorkshire Dales and Peak District, be targets for rewilding? And if not, Andrew says, what would be the top 3 or 4 areas that you would suggest that rewilding be focused on? There we go. Right.
I think I think with this, what we've really learned is it's a bit risky doing this because, you know, it's just middle-class urban people telling rural people what to do, and you just get a really bad reaction, quite right. And I think I really admire what Rewilding Europe did, where they said, look, we've got some visions, we've got some ideas, we've got some expertise. If anybody would like to do a rewilding project, come and approach us. And that's sort of like, you know, not by invitation, but saying, look, you know, we're here to help, but we're not going to say where things should be on it. You know, that problem of designating bits on the map and saying we should do this. I mean, that all of our landscapes are inhabited. So I more prefer the idea of sort of, you know, putting broad ideas out. Hey, you know, we could do this. Have you ever thought of like, you know, I mean, wouldn't it be amazing if we rewilded the River Severn? You know, and you sort of put out just big visions, and then people can say, you know, come around them, and if they like them, great. Or what about rewilding the River Trent right the way, you know, past Nottingham, right the way into the Humber? Wouldn't that be amazing? We've forgotten about that whole central bit of Britain. So I'm a bit more in favour of just putting out very sort of broad, audacious visions, which people can buy into or not, rather than actually putting zones on the map, because I just think that gets us, I don't know, you know, it just seems a bit sort of dictating, or can put people's backs up.
I think that there are kind of areas that do kind of have more, let's say, more scope for improvement. So, for example, the National Nature Reserves, I think it is, isn't it, Paul, that have some intrinsic kind of expectation for innovation within their boundaries. So they are open to kind of more perhaps radical thinking. And similarly, some of the national parks, I think they recognise that they need to do better. That's not to say that they would embrace full-scale rewilding across the national park, but certainly incorporating some rewilding principles into how they manage the parks in the future is worth having that debate and discussion.
And if it's not getting too technical, you may know under the government's plan for its new environmental land management scheme, there's this so-called thing called Tier 3 payments, where if clusters of farmers get together and do something pretty radical, actually, then they'll get public money for that. And that is an opportunity to sort of rewilding to, you know, and this is already happening, and Rewilding Britain is brilliant about this, going to sort of areas where, you know, there might be, where there's good opportunities rewilding, and where there might be an economic basis for rewilding, and talking to farmers and saying, look, are you interested in this? You know, do you know, because it always, a lot of it depends on the cohesion of the rural communities, you know, whether people are willing to take risks together and how it works on that sort of thing. So there are opportunities there, and you can see that that when we're looking about, you know, what is the economic value of rewilding, it's this idea that there's all of the, you know, the natural flood management side of it, which we need to, you know, it's a better way to pay for flood management. I would argue is, you know, using natural processes rather than building bigger and bigger culverts or whatever around our rivers. So there's money there in it, but also, and this maybe go back to the beginning of the talk, you know, this enthusiasm for nature. One of the ideas is that as our lives are becoming more and more technological, and everything's becoming affordable or rentable or streamable, you know, what's becoming valuable in life? I mean, I don't know what to buy my family for Christmas now. I used to just buy them the latest album and everybody was happy, you know, the latest CD that's in it. So this idea that actually what is becoming valuable is experiences, and outdoor experiences, and high quality nature experiences. I mean, you know, it is pretty cool going to get photographs of a stallion herd of feral or wilded horses, that actually that might be one of the economic opportunities of rewilding. And of course, then you're starting to look at areas which may be close to urban centres, which people can easily get to, and so forth. So I think that is a way of thinking about where might be good for rewilding, where there's some, you know, some good landscape, there's farmers who want to get together, could start rewilding land and then have these sort of multiple revenue streams, you know, maybe off experiential tourism, maybe off wild meat or high quality meat, and then payments for flood management, that sort of idea.
That's actually a really interesting point about the economics of it, and I was going to touch on the. So, if anyone doesn't know, the environmental land management currently kind of in discussion is essentially the replacement. Now the UK is leaving the EU. It's actually the replacement for the Common Agricultural Policy payments. So interesting to see. And I think, again, in the last talk, we talked about how the reduction in meat production, hopefully, as people start to eat more land, vegetable-based diets, will reduce the amount of grazing. And there's a lot of society kind of challenges around there. There's lots of communities that are built up around farming, around cattle farming, sheep farming, and so on and so forth. So it's interesting about how we can create other revenue streams that encourage more diversity than others. I'm just going to take a plug here for Heal Rewilding from XR Hammersmith and Fulham, apparently, as a project to start buying up a rewilding land, which sounds interesting.
Yeah, we mentioned them earlier when you were asking about, how did someone put it, about a project which everybody could contribute to.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah. So they're actually looking, so I'll look at that.
Oh, Heal Rewilding are cool, yeah.
So Simona asks, how could we use all the cattle we already have for meat production and convert the industrial approach to a rewilding one? Could we still keep some of the meat production? This could be the part of the wild of the, yeah. So essentially, how could we? Where does, I suppose, rewilding it does include some sort of meat production in it? It's not just because obviously the herbivores would otherwise be too much. I don't know how does that fit into the scheme.
So we could have a livestock version of rewilding. So it's interesting. I was having some conversations with, in fact, the last talk I did actually was with a farming community in Wales on this. We were talking about it, and what they were talking about is how their farming or how their livestock rearing had changed over the last 30 years, where they used to every summer they'd take cattle as well as sheep up onto the the uplands and then bring them down in the winter. So there's a form of transhumance going on there, and that has been lost on it. But reinstating those sorts of processes where you're getting these grazing dynamics, if you're doing that with a mix of cattle and so forth, then there is the potential for a sort of new form of herding. And this might be, again, this might be technologically based, that you're following where your herds are, because this was always the problem, that if you wanted to do extensive grazing, how do you round your herds up? How do you actually bring them back? But again, technology is helping with that you can track your herds, you can find them on the, you can follow them on your quad bike or whatever. So it's not that you've got to go sort of wandering around as an old, shepherd or whatever out in the hills. So I think there are real opportunities to do that. And I think that idea of saying, well, great that a lot of people are going vegetarian, and that's taking away from the craziness of, growing grain in the Amazon or wherever and feeding it to cattle. And they're not even made to be fed grain, getting rid of that craziness, but not saying to get rid of that craziness, we want to lose the really important role of cattle and large herbivores in the countryside. We just want to get that back into a more sensible way of doing it. And if we could do that in a more natural way with herd structures and then be eating that really high quality meat off them, that seems to me to be quite a good compromise or a good way forward all round.
Yeah, there's a comment here from Martha about the balance between the need to feed the population of the UK and rewilding enough to make an impact. Do we need to change our diets to make this work?
We also need to feed the mental health of people in the UK as well.
Yeah. Who owns the land? Luke says it's a huge issue. Grouse estates as an example of our countryside being distorted for the profit making of a very few wealthy individuals.
Yeah, that's our problem.
Okay, there's nothing to be said there. That's a challenge. So let's look at Heal Rewilding. Until
we get into public acquisition of land again. Yeah. I don't know. I mean, if anybody's got an idea on that one, I'd love to hear it, because
it is the kind of, and I know, again, looking at obviously local authorities, they don't exactly have huge amounts of cash, but creating, I know the idea has been floated about municipal bonds to be used to people that invest in bonds for local authorities that can be used to buy up land, rewild land, energy opportunities.
So this is you're touching on what I do for the day job now, actually. But there is some interesting opportunities in these new financial mechanisms and things which are coming in through the new environmental bill of net gain, where every development has to do 10% or more positive impact for biodiversity than what it's damaged. these are going to create new flows of money. So there's quite a lot of thinking there about how we might be able to invest in it. But still the problem is that, you know, the land assets are, sorry, I shouldn't whinge about this because I know land's expensive anywhere, but they are, you know, and interestingly, sort of as a diversion of this slightly, in Eastern Europe, where, you know, all land was owned by the state and then leased out, so you leased grazing rights and you leased hunting rights and what have you, rewilders in Eastern Europe can actually buy up grazing rights and then graze over large areas. So you don't have to buy the land, you can buy the rights on it. Which is, sorry, that's an aside, but we don't have these opportunities in the UK. And I think this is where we just need some, I don't know, clever thinking or change of policy or.
Interesting.
So, I mean, it's a bit random, but it is related to rewilding. But we're actually, one of the things we've been talking about today is a beaver tenancy agreement, and again, it's a novel kind of way of, you know, enabling trophic species to be using the land, or ecosystem engineers, and enabling landowners or people who are interacting with those species to benefit from that interaction. So I think there will be a new wave, and it'd be interesting, perhaps, Ben, to talk to your next speaker about the futurist and technologies that can enable kind of those sorts of things to work at scale.
Yeah, don't ruin the surprise for the next speaker.
Yeah.
Peter has got a wonderful comment. Thank you for this, Peter. How might human personal waste from defecation help enrich the land? Are there alternatives to the sewage systems we currently use?
Well, of course, there used to be one all around London where it was all put on the horticultural fields. That's how cities used to work it, wasn't it? It was night soil, is that what it was called? Yeah. Where we actually, we grew vegetables with it. But, I mean, you know, we just lost these systems. I mean, that was amazing. I mean, that's where a lot of gardening rooted, wasn't it? This sort of urban horticulture. I don't know.
Okay, well,
again, I haven't really thought about that.
No, we'll carry on with that one. Toby, questions on your demonstration projects. What would be a measure of success, and what would happen to a failed demonstration project? How does funding, investment, and contracts need to change to enable demonstration projects to happen? Lots of questions in one there, Toby.
Yeah. So, so in some ways, to demonstrate. So, just run through that. How would it happen, or what would happen if it fell apart?
Measures of success, you know, how do you define success in a demonstration project, and what would failure be, and what would happen if it failed?
Yeah, so it's interesting. So let's have a look at some of the success indicators on it. One of them is the rewilding success indicators. Are we seeing natural processes re-emerging? And one of the really interesting success indicators there is when something happens which absolutely surprises you, which you didn't realise happened in ecology. You know, so when actually nature is surprising you, and that sounds a bit woolly, but you can actually measure that. And so if the unexpected happens, if a species comes back, or if a particular community emerges, then you know that nature is on its way, if you like, if those natural processes are starting to emerge.
A good example of that is the Knepp estate, where they weren't expecting to be one of the major breeding sites for nightingale, for example, and turtle dove. Yeah.
There is some more technical stuff in terms of, so there's a lot of research going on this, on what are rewilding indicators here, and how do we indicate, how do we do this? Because of course all of our old system has just been about counting species in habitats and so forth. So there's the ecological success indicators. Another success indicator is an interesting one. So one of the ideas, if they are bringing about that transformational change, is that it's actually the types of people who get involved in it, and the partnerships which that project starts forging with other actors in society, or other sort of progressives in society. And again, that can be measured. It's sort of like the address book, but who's in the address book side of thing. And then another one is public reaction to it. So, you know, are people going there? Are they talking about it? You know, I think a demonstration project has to be a point of public discourse. So that is all measurable as well. So I put those sort of three success indicators of, the fourth one, of course, is its financial viability, which, and actually an interesting, a fifth one is when it runs into problems, can you solve the problems? And that comes back to that second one of, has it assembled a bunch of people in different walks of life who can just solve problems when they come up? So that's the dealing with uncertainty.
I think it's also with the backdrop of the idea that rewilding is, it's something that happens over time. It's not necessarily always a quick fix. So has the project been given the space to breathe and given the opportunity to recognise that rewilding is very much an open-ended management system? It isn't always designed for an endpoint in mind. So you need to expect that there will be changes, and some of that change may, for example, in our countryside, result in species that we, as we mentioned before, have become familiar with and cherish declining, while overall biomass, let's say, or abundance of other interesting species starts to increase. And that's quite a difficult debate, and I'm sure it will rage on, but that openness is quite a key parameter.
And then the question of what to do if it's unsuccessful. I think probably two things to mention there. So I think, when going into rewilding projects, you've got to be responsible about it. So a lot of it is thinking about, what are the risks or what would happen. So when we were talking about the living rivers, the rewilding rivers, actually, river modelers are, there's such expertise. So those projects, there's a lot of modeling goes on, with what would happen if you do it. That's the whole purpose of them. A lot of it's natural flood management. So the risk should have been, the serious risk should have been planned through on it. If just for argument's sake, if we rewilded, a 300 hectare farm or something like that, and it just went wrong, well, that's just like, you're just going bust like any other business, any other enterprise. And you sell your assets and you say, okay, we'll learn from that. How can we do it better next time? And, we'll feel a bit shameful or a bit rubbish about it. But I think that's part of the idea. It's like, it is a journey. It's a new journey. And if you're going on any journey, you might get into problems or it might just not work out. But that's adventure, isn't it?
Some failure is to be expected.
Yeah. Yes, I think you're right. Embracing failure, I think, is part of the rewilding ethos, but not being reckless. That's not the point, I think, there.
Fantastic. So we've got quite a lot of questions, but we are starting to lose people. So I'm going to suggest that we go for another sort of 10, 15 minutes to 9 o'clock, and we start to do a sort of quick fire round. So thank you very much. There's still 35 people on the call, which is fantastic. Really appreciate it. I'm glad everyone's enjoying it. But I'm going to start doing some quick fire questions. Ask the questions, and one of you has to pick who's going to answer, and then the other one will answer the next question. Actually, I'm going to start with a comment from Kay. Apparently, George Monbiot's book Feral utterly changed her own baseline view of the national parks. So that's a plug there. Dan?
I'll respond to that one. I agree.
Himalayan sky burials in the UK. It's not just pets, according to Dan. I don't know what Himalayan sky burial is, but sounds interesting.
Himalayan sky burial.
No.
Oh goodness, yeah, interesting. That's the way I'd like to go. Yeah.
Okay, I have no idea.
Oh, sorry. Be remembered or whatever the word is.
Okay, interesting conversation about Caroline. If you the dead animals that you would leave, obviously that's a bit of a challenge in our society. If you left them to rot, would it increase pets and birds like magpies, which there might be too many of them? And then someone else later down the line says, is that a human-centric view that the magpies are actually a pest? But yeah, I suppose there's a question on, if you are leaving, there's a reason that rotten animals are cleaned up, I suppose. So is there dangers of encouraging too many pests, and would that be a negative thing?
I think our magpies are seen as they actually would fulfil the niche of what the oxpecker would fulfill, and they do provide would provide an important function within that sort of cycle of life. But again, with any system, you will get, the system has a carrying capacity, and you will see fluxes of certain species over time.
Yeah, with rewilding, you need to accept boom and bust natures.
Interesting. Thank you. So David says he would love to see more vertical and roof gardens in London and other cities. How can we help promote this form of rewilding?
Yeah, I think, again, engage with your local councils, your green space officers, the large construction firms, and making sure that they're challenged when they send their planning applications in to make sure that when, particularly with the new Environment Bill, the requirements for biodiversity net gain, they need to be demonstrating that they are delivering on that. And this is a great way to do that in an urban environment.
But maybe also the property companies. I mean, one of the sort of rewilding principles is better an offer than an ask. So, you know, if you could find property companies who've got flat roof, I don't know, offices, and say, oh, you know, we could offer you something here. It might be that people living in those offices might like to go up to these roof gardens or, you know, rewilding areas. Yeah,
green roofs are definitely a thing. And I know in France now, there's a legislation that you can't build a new property without putting either solar panels or green roofs on the roof.
Is that right?
Yeah, which is quite fascinating. Obviously, there's structural challenges around putting lots of soil and stuff on roofs, but there's definitely...
The architects are great at structural challenges.
Lou says one of the best examples she thinks of rewilding in London are the railway embankments, actually.
Yeah.
Which is good. Can I keep going? So, interest for Ferdy. You talked about letting nature take its course on rewilding. A good example is Chernobyl. Within a very short time, the radiation is a massive comeback in an unimaginable way. This is something that's good to be. Is that a good example of literally it's just been left?
Yeah, an amazing example. But, you know, again, when we talk about starting condition, they literally just did leave it. But, I mean, they did wipe out a lot of, there was that really great documentary on it. I hadn't quite realised that they wiped out lots of the dogs and everything. They went round afterwards and cleansed it, some of the animals. But,
oh, wow.
Yeah. Probably another great example is the no man's land between North and South Korea, the habitat there supported.
Yeah.
Didn't know that. Wow. Yeah. Oh, I'll let Paul answer that one.
Sorry. So, question from Luke. He read some time ago the German government put legislation in place requiring all farmers to make 10% of the land wild. Is this true? And can we shift farmers' mindset away from exploiting every bit of their land?
I think it's very hard to put these sort of regulations in post hoc. I mean, I don't know. I mean, I think the trouble here. I mean, I don't think we want to antagonise farmers or landowners. I mean, their citizens like, oh, it's just finding ways, common ground where it can work for everybody. So, you know, that might deliver an outcome, but I think it might have quite a few negative.
Yeah, I think it comes.
You know, we've got to work together, I think, on this.
I think it also perhaps of a different approach, as one Paul already touched on, which is sort of encouraging clusters of farms to do their bit, so that the cumulative effect is greater than anyone would have achieved anyway.
And I think you know, it's this offer again. I mean, you know, saying, look, we've got some ideas. You know, they should work. They could work economically. I mean, one of the big issues for a lot of farms is transition finance. How do you transition from, you know, agriculture and you've got all this kit on hire, doing a more natural approach of it. But I think that, you know, finding really positive ways of working and saying, look, you know, you might enjoy, because quite a lot of farmers are saying they actually would like to farming a different way, because it's pretty boring driving along in a tractor listening to Radio 2 all day, you know. So, you know, there might be a sort of life quality aspect to the offer as well.
May I suggest one thing?
Yeah.
Just in terms of maybe not as much farmers, but with private landowners who maybe aren't using it for farms, you know, appealing to their sense of a bigger picture and kind of goal. There were those kinds of responses during the war, right? When there was a collective vision, there was something that everyone was doing together for the better of the country. That kind of narrative, you know, could help when people actually realize this is a global issue.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, I think you just said the collective vision for our countryside. I mean, you know, what is the vision for our countryside in 2050? I think we could do something amazing, and I think maybe putting out that, you know, that vision, that audacious vision, and you know, seeing if people will help make it real. That'd be brilliant.
I mean, we're seeing some of this happen with practices like natural flood management, where organisations like water companies and Environment Agency are offering landowners the opportunity to put some of these features on their land, and they're doing what's called a reverse auction. And this is actually speaking the language that farmers are familiar with, and this is encouraging them to actually be actively involved and wanting to put forward their offers, and you know, that they get shortlisted on whoever has the best offer for the best return on investment.
Brilliant, thank you. So let's going to keep moving on. The microforests are called Miawi. There's a link there.
Miyawaki.
Miyawaki, thank you very much. So there's a link there in the chat. Thank you very much for that. Caroline says she lives on the edge of the Surrey Hills and it's still very manicured. People don't like change. They see the landscape as being always the same. We've had a lot of ash dieback and they see the trees being taken out as a new habitat where most people are horrified by the tree loss. Wood edge is really important for birds and butterflies. One of the things the big herbivores did was to keep trees down and allow lots of areas in between. Thank you very much for that, Caroline. I'm going to not have that as a comment. I'm going to keep moving forward. Thomas says, what resources are available to landowners in England who have an interest in rewilding? I think you've mentioned some of them. So Rewilding Britain and kind of European rewilding. Is there any other ones that you'd suggest?
There's a new book coming out soon. I think it's on the 23rd of July.
Good plug. I like that. So, Sally, sorry, I'm just going to carry on.
I was going to say, on the resources, it's really, there's emerging networks, which if people are interested in, they can get involved with these networks. So, you know, there's a UK one, which I think is going to be launched in about 4 or 5 months. There's already a European rewilding network. There is actually a finance facility where you can get loans for enterprises relating to rewilding run by Rewilding Europe. So, like, you know, they're loans, but they're loans which come with rewilding advice, which is pretty handy. So there's some stuff out there.
Sally says East London Waterworks Park is a project to try to buy and develop a swimming pool and nature pond in the old filter beds on a brownfield site. We are wrestling with the balance of letting nature take its course, but providing something prettier with planting. Any suggestions for Sally in terms of the balance?
I think one thing I would say with rewilding, there's this really nice idea of a rewilding scale from 1 up to 10. And of course, we're always constrained about how far we can go up that scale of wildness, if you like. And in many urban areas, and maybe a place like this where it's an old swimming pool, you may have started off at 0 or 1. But if you can get 2 or 3 notches up that scale, that's just as good as if you're, you know, in the wilds of Scotland or Eastern Europe, where it's already at 7 and you're going up to 9. So I think we should, you know, it's not getting to the ultimate, it's just getting up a couple of notches on those 3 scales. I was saying, but in terms of planting, what would you suggest?
There's some really really appealing, sort of visually appealing things you can do with sort of sustainable urban drainage, kind of well designed, in incorporating sort of aquatic flowering plants. Also, if what tends to happen is with a lot of kind of seeding projects, they tend to be a little bit too grass dominant, and so seeding, when you're reseeding areas, if you actually use a wildflower kind of dominant mix, you get much more colour, much more kind of diversity in that sward, and it's great for bees and butterflies and insects as well. So yeah, just thinking about putting a little bit less grass in the mix and more flowers, and thinking about wetlands and aquatic systems, because they attract all sorts of things.
Brilliant, thank you guys.
That sounds very helpful, thank you.
Yeah, and don't feel you've got to be too purist either. At the end
yeah, of it, no, it's
just enjoy it. You know?
Good. I'm glad you said that.
Fantastic. I'm going to plough through. I'm happy to go on for another few minutes if people are. You still have sort of 30 people here and loads of questions to get through. So, you know, another 5-10 minutes. But a quick question for Ben, actually. So our idea on Occupy, which is essentially there's loads of oak trees that are going to get wasted if we don't do something with them, and we're trying to see if we can actually get them planted. Is that actually a good idea, or is that a bad idea in terms of rewilding?
Well, it depends is the quick answer.
Yeah. Okay.
So yeah, absolutely, planting trees is a fantastic thing to do. Oak are an amazing pioneer species. They, as I think, you know, everyone knows that they support so many insects and other forms of life. And you know, it can't be a bad thing to do. All I would say with all of these things is, you know, kind of think about the end point a little bit and what the evolution of that kind of planting is going to be. You know, Paul's already touched on some of the. If you plant too densely, then you get tall, upright standards that don't have much underneath them. If you, you know, you're at risk of having a sea of plastic if you're using things like that. There are, you know, more natural regeneration kind of techniques, as I mentioned earlier, that enable a diversity of habitat to form that support those trees. And I'd certainly, if there's space, I would encourage that to be the case.
I think it's also thinking about what you want the oak tree to become. So You could have it as a woodland tree where you're planting it so it's growing tall and straight, sequestering carbon, and then it's used for timber, and then that timber is then embedded in construction, which is this is the lifespan of the oak. And I think that's a really sensible thing to do, because if we could move to using timber beams rather than steel, that would be a really sort of whole life sort of carbon type thing. So, but if you're going to plant it for that purpose, you need to plant it in a certain way, as a woodland, as a timber tree on it. Or you might say, well, actually what we want to do is plant it in a more rewilding way, where we're remembering what an oak was in these wood pasture systems, where it was more like, where it naturally probably was a savanna tree, and they branch out, and then as they get older, they put down these branches which sort of support them, and they become these huge trees on it. Now, if that's your imagining for the future, which you'll never see, but it's one of these lovely things which should be there in 200 or 300 years, then you'll be choosing a site and maybe actually planting it early on, or enabling it so it could do that spreading early on. So I think, as Cain says, it's...
Can I cut in just there?
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, hi.
Yeah, we can, Adam. Jump in.
Yeah, I just would say that, although the project of Occupy is only about oaks, by reserving the land and putting a few oaks on it, it's not to say that no other species will grow on the land, or that no farmer can't plant any other species on the land, of course.
Yeah. I mean, personally, in urban areas where I don't think there's a space to do the forest ones, I really like the idea of planting trees which are actually productive trees, which at one stage will then go into the building construction, and we're reducing steel in building. I don't know, that story appeals to me. It might be naive or whatever, but
no, it's true. Every meter cubed of wood used in building sequesters a ton of carbon. So there's a big push towards timber frame buildings, and skyscrapers made out of timber as well now. Some really interesting stuff in that.
I think the key there is having a varied age class between your trees, so you're not getting this monoculture of all standards all maturing at the same time.
Yeah, interesting.
Brilliant. Thanks, that guys, really useful.
Yeah, thank you. I'm going to just sort of start ploughing through a bit more, just as we're sort of at time, and I don't want to keep everyone around, but we seem to still have 28 people here, so people seem to be interested. So I'm just going to sort of sum of the comments. So Jonathan, quite a big comment here, but essentially saying, is there a risk that rewilding takes off and we don't have the right kind of grazers or predators in place, and you get landscapes that become undesirable with aggressive plants? How can we manage this? Is it acceptable to step in and semi-manage the landscapes to make sure that the kind of image maintains what the public like? If that makes sense. It's a bit of a rambling question. And
I think
summary is a bit rambling. Sorry, Jonathan.
Absolutely, in many respects. I mean, not forgetting that there are industries that have built up around managing the land as well, and just to turn that off probably is not good from an economic or social welfare kind of perspective. And there are points at which sometimes an intervention can help. I think we've already talked about some of the, seeding or kind of creating initial or pioneer habitats to enable the development of habitats. But also, you do get invasive species that can dominate different areas, like Japanese knotweed we're familiar with, and Himalayan balsam, for example. And, control of those, and not necessarily, I don't necessarily mean chemical treatment. There are mechanical means, and there are use of other plant species that can kind of outcompete those. Those are the sorts of things that you do probably need some kind of intervention. Otherwise, they can take over. So, yeah, I think that's where the, bringing together communities of, people who care, people who are supportive, engaging citizens in supporting those kind of practices. It all helps with the education and sort of evolution of that rewilded kind of area.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to carry on. I'm going to skip a few and just sort of go for comments with people I haven't heard from yet, if that's okay. So Rob says, the buyout of Langham Moor in Scotland is a great example of the challenge of buying land to do ecological restoration. The cost in the region of 4.5 million. So far, they've got a GoFundMe linked on the chat, which has only raised a few 100,000, which is still pretty impressive, frankly.
Not bad.
So I don't know if you would know about this one. That's an interesting example.
Langham Moor.
So, here we go through. Okay. Earthwork hobbit housing is what we would love to build here instead of barrack housing. How do we persuade the council? Earthwork hobbit housing. That's an interesting one. Churchyards that are grown and left to go wild. Does that make a difference?
Yeah, I think they're part of a network of ecological kind of recovery areas. Certainly my local church have got a rewilded area within their grounds, and it can form part of, we talked about gardens a little bit earlier, and I think everyone can do their bit in that respect, allowing your garden to go a bit wilder and connect with your neighbours. And I think we had an article out with iNews on Sunday about acting like a pig and things like that in your garden. So yeah, I think churches absolutely play a role, and they already support quite a diversity of lower plants. Actually, they're quite neglected in the sense of supporting bryophytes and lichens and other sort of species that perhaps people aren't quite so passionate about, but are important for our ecosystems.
Brilliant, thank you. I'm actually, the rest of the comments are everyone saying, thank you very much, this has been very fascinating, which I don't know if you're reading the comments. Excellent. I'll finish off with the question is, we really look forward to reading your book. Where can we buy that isn't Amazon?
Yeah, all reputable bookstores, and so I think Hive sell them.
It's not out yet though, on the 23rd. Yeah.
23rd, yeah.
23rd of July.
Is a nature-based
oh yeah, Natural
bookstore.
History Book Service, that's a good one to get it from if you want to support a wildlife business. Yeah.
Natural History Book Service, there we go, fantastic. So we'll leave it there. Paul and Kate, thank you very, very much. That was absolutely fascinating. We've still got 25 people or so in the room, so that's fantastic. I think we had about 83 was our top at one point. So that was really, really cool. And thank you very much everyone who's joined. We will be following up, as I said, with some points and a recording of this so everyone can pass it on. And if you have any questions, the company is, how do you pronounce it? Ecosulus?
Ecosulus, yeah.
Ecosulus, which obviously I'm sure you wouldn't mind any questions. But yeah, once again, thank you very much, Kane and Paul. It's been a fascinating couple of hours.
No, thank you, and thanks for the great questions, everybody.
Yeah,
comments.
Really stimulating. Thank you.
Brilliant, wonderful.
Okay, Kane and Paul.
Take care, everyone. We will be. There'll be more of these coming. We're going to try and do these once a month, and with some interesting ones coming up, including I think next month is eco-anxiety, a book on eco-anxiety. So a lot of us in Extinction Rebellion obviously have to deal with that a lot. So that's all good. So yeah, thank you very much, everyone. We'll call it a night and take care.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Ben. Take care.
Thank you, Kane. Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Ben. Thanks, everyone. Bye.